Welcome. I am very excited to be here today with Marianne Worthington, editor of Still, the Journal. Welcome, Marianne. So great to see you.
Thanks, Becky. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So tell us, are you one of the founders of the magazine?
I am. I co-founded it with two other people who are no longer associated with the magazine,
Mhm.
but were for about a decade. Silas House and Jason Howard were my co-founders. They're both Kentucky writers and editors and teachers like me.
Oh, yeah. And so you started the magazine in 2009, is that correct?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, feels like forever ago.
Yes. 13 years.
That's
Yeah,
amazing. Yeah.
we just published our 40th issue.
Oh, congrats.
Yeah,
So, was the magazine online from the very beginning?
it was. And that was one of the things that we wanted to do. There weren't that many magazines that we knew of that published and wanted to publish the kind of writing and writers that we tend to publish,
Mm-hmm.
which is a focus on Appalachia.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if you know your geography, you know that Appalachia includes 13 states.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a big region, but we weren't really all that familiar with other online avenues. And so that's one of the things that we wanted to do was provide free access. And so, yes, it's always been online. Yeah.
Yeah. So, how did you meet the other editors that you created the journal with?
Well, we actually met at a writing workshop,
Mm.
and then we figured out that we were neighbors, that we lived just a county away from each other.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how it started. We met as strangers, but then we figured out that we were actually neighbors. So
Oh, that's so
um,
cool.
yeah, so that's how it got started.
And so, just to backtrack for 1 second, can you clear up, is it Appalachia or Appalachia? And I was
Uh,
reading about it this morning, and the thing I was reading said, oh, well, the imperialists pronounce it Appalachia. But if you're from the area and if you want to show solidarity with people that live in the area, it's Appalachia.
That's pretty much true.
Okay.
But although I don't think that there is a right or wrong way to say the word, but
Right.
if you're native and you want to show others that you're native to the
Hmm.
region, we tend
Hmm.
to say Appalachia. And
Okay.
we tend to cringe when people say Appalachia or, the other
Uh-huh.
sorts of
It outs them as
pronunciations.
outsiders.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, if we go back to the beginning, what was the reason for wanting to create this magazine? Sounds like there wasn't anything like this at the time, but did you feel like, yeah, there's no one representing this place, and you clearly have a connection to this place? Was it the connection to the natural environment, the connection to the people? Like, what was it that made you feel like we really have to start a magazine?
I think that Appalachia and Appalachian people have always been sensitive about other people telling their stories. And
Mm.
it's one of the reasons why there are still stereotypes about Appalachians in the national media. It's because people don't want to let go of all those stereotypes in the region. And so one of the ways that Appalachian literature and Appalachian writers began to find their voice, especially at the turn of the last century, was they said, "We're tired of everybody else trying to write our story. We're
Mhm.
going to do it."
Mm.
So that was kind of a foundational feeling that we had, but also we all three of us were interested in the literature of the region, and it tends to be the type of literature that we write. So yes, it does have to do with the natural environment,
Mhm.
um, but we wanted a way to showcase writers who had some kind of connection to the region.
Mm.
And so the writing that we take and that we publish doesn't have to be about Appalachia,
Oh, okay.
not at all.
Mhm.
Um, but we like to focus on people who have a connection to the region.
Mhm.
Sometimes that connection is their publisher, or their granny grew up in West Virginia,
Mm,
and they spent summers there, but have never lived in Appalachia. So
mm.
we're pretty wide open as long as people can show that they have some kind of a connection to the region.
Okay, interesting. So how would they just say in their cover letter, this is a story about my trip to London, but I spend summers in West Virginia. Is that something that
Yes,
you'd be open to?
yes, that's exactly what we do. We ask people write a sentence or two about their connection
Hmm.
to the Appalachian region.
Okay, interesting. So, does the work have to speak to a sense of place? Is that the important, or there's
Not
no thematic constraint at all?
Not necessarily, although a lot of the work that we do publish does speak to place.
Hmm.
But again, Appalachia is a vast, wide
Yeah.
region and very diverse. And so one of
Hmm.
our goals from the very beginning has been to publish writing that speaks to that diversity
Hmm.
and speaks to that variety of voices in the
Hmm.
region.
Yeah,
So
that's great. Can you talk more about that? Because I think for people who are not familiar with the region, myself included, I think of the Appalachian Trail and I think
right.
of hiking and nature. And then West Virginia and sort of like loose things ideas that I've sort of absorbed in the culture.
Right.
But I don't know the specifics of like the kind of diversity that you're talking about. So can you say more about like things that excite you
Sure.
that maybe people don't know about this region?
Sure. Well, one of the things is that when other people were telling our stories back
Mhm.
at the turn of the last century, one of the definitions that got thrown out uh, and that sort of stuck was that Appalachia was primarily white people.
Mm.
And so there have always been people of color, black people, queer people, differently abled people. They've
Mhm.
always been here. So for instance, one of the things that our friend Frank X. Walker did was he coined a term called that he invented
Mm.
called Afro-Latchin,
Mhm.
and he started a poets collective,
Mhm.
which is still going. This was in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s. Um, and so it was a collective for writers of color, people of color, and black people
Mhm.
to claim their place, their heritage, their lineage in Appalachia.
Mm.
So we have that.
Mhm.
Um, and also, I'll just mention very briefly that the West Virginia born writer whose parents immigrated from India, Nima Avashia, has
Mhm.
just published about 9 months ago a memoir called Another Appalachia,
Mm.
which shows her diverse background. She grew up in what's sometimes called um, the Chemical Valley.
Mm.
Her father worked for Union Carbide in West Virginia,
Mhm.
but they were from India. And Nima is also gay.
Mm.
So those kinds of voices
Mhm.
were, we strive to celebrate those kinds of voices as much
Mhm.
as we can.
Great. Yeah. And what do you see? Do you sort of see the people's ideas that they have about Appalachia reflected in the submissions? Do you tend to see a lot of submissions that deal with like they see you're an Appalachian themed magazine and they think, okay, great, I can send this work that kind of repeats similar tropes and familiar ideas about the place?
Yes, and we usually reject those. We usually do. I mean, it's what we sometimes call the mossy fence post
Mm.
writing. The grandma on the front porch smoking a corncob pipe, and the feudist brothers in the background who are running off the revenuers.
Right, right.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, people do still write that kind of thing, and there's a lot of that sort of nostalgic,
Hmm.
sentimental writing. We do see some of that, yeah.
Hmm.
It's not something that we like to celebrate or
Right, right.
perpetuate, but we do get those kind
Yeah, so that's interesting because all that said, on the site there's a nonfiction piece about a grandmother, and it starts with the grandmother feeding the granddaughter fried chicken, right? And the granddaughter's very quiet, and it's about her relationship to her own silence. But what will make a piece distinguish itself from the kind of, if you're trying to avoid like the quaint relationship to grandma and grandpa sitting out on the porch, but a piece does touch on those things, where do you draw that line? What makes a piece jump out at you as actually this is transcending those kinds of familiar ideas?
that very thing, what you just
Yeah.
said, that those tropes are transcended,
Mm.
and that they're not there for the sake of a trope or a storyline or a plot
Hmm.
line.
Hmm.
So yeah, we look for those transcendent things.
Hmm.
This week, in fact, I told a group of students about my own experiences for the first time in writing in college, because I didn't really understand, what poets were supposed to write about when I was in college. But
Hmm.
I had this teacher who said to us on the first day of class, okay, I want you to remember your grandparents. And I was shocked. I didn't know that, you could write about your grandparents, and
Right,
and people would want to read that.
right.
Um, so 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 yeah, I think writing about your grandmother's one thing, but as long as she's not a part of those kind of stereotypes that we tend to,
Yeah. So
yeah.
actually that's funny, because I tend to I mean, I love I have a great relationship with my grandparents, but I do um kind of shy away from writing about them sometimes. I think there is that fear of like the sentimental kind of
Yes.
driving the work. So do you actually, since you are a teacher, do you actually have advice for anyone watching this, students, writers, but how to sort of make their work transcendent or make it fresh or get away from the sentimentality and say something actually meaningful?
I think in every stereotype, there is that tiny little measure of truth.
Mm.
Um, and 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 so if you can, as a writer, if you can dig in and find that truth, that I think that helps to sort of quell the sentimentality and the
Mhm.
nostalgia for nostalgia's sake, for sentimentality's sake. Um, and another thing that I try to do is find the rough and the rowdy part of the
Mm.
story. What's the ugly part of the
Mhm.
story that you can tell? There's almost always an ugly part of the story. Or focus on sensory language
Mm.
rather than um just trying to report or chronicle something that happened to you in your childhood.
Mhm.
If you can help the reader smell it, see it, taste it, etc.
Mhm.
So I think paying attention to the senses and looking for that truth that might not be so pretty, that
Mhm.
can go into anything, a poem, a
Mhm.
story,
Yeah, yeah. It's
prose.
actually what you just said made me think also maybe letting the reader do some work themselves. So you're not spelling out like the message, the emotional message that you want the reader to take away. You're just laying out the scene and providing the sensory information, sort of letting them sort it out for themselves.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting. So take us through your editorial process. And if it helps, maybe if you want to talk about like one specific story that was recently submitted, what went on behind the scenes? How did you decide yes or no? Did you work with the writer? What kind of editing went on? Stuff like that.
Well, first of all, we have a nonfiction editor and a fiction editor.
Mhm.
And I tend to serve as poetry editor and sort
Okay.
of managing editor.
Mm.
So the nonfiction editor and the fiction editor, our rule has always been they do their thing and we don't get in each other's way.
Mm.
Okay. Now, sometimes we'll have a piece that we might have a question about and we'll check with the other editors. Okay.
Mm.
So I can really only speak about poetry. So with poetry, I guess the thing that we look for is, first of all, that there is some facility with language
Mhm.
that is interesting, unique, unexpected. We don't mind form. We like inventive form. There is a poem up right now by Yvonne Johnson that is a contrapuntal poem,
Mm.
um, which is very interesting. So it breaks on both sides, and you read the left side as one poem, the right side as another poem, and then you can read the lines across as
Mm.
a third type of poem. We love that sort of invention,
Mhm.
and playing around with form. We think that poems work best when they do something to surprise the reader, and
Mhm.
whether that's a shock or a gasp or something unexpected. Um, and sometimes we'll get poems that aren't quite ready yet.
Mhm.
And then if the writer's willing, we'll work back and forth with editing
Mm.
suggestions. Um, we get so many poetry submissions, probably more than nonfiction or fiction,
Oh.
um, that it's usually not hard to fill our pages,
Mhm.
because we get so much.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, we do work with writers very closely if they're
Mhm.
willing. Sometimes, they're not
Yeah.
willing. They don't want to change what they've written.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
um, and I will say that I know for sure that our other editors, Karen McElmurray and Julia Watts, do the same thing with their
Mhm.
pieces, whether it's nonfiction or fiction.
Mhm.
So
And is that also true for the prose submissions that you like to see experiments in form and sort of more innovative approaches to the writing?
yes, I mean we don't discount that at all.
Mhm.
In fact, we've been publishing a lot more flash
Mm.
or micro
Mhm.
prose than we have in the past, and we welcome that.
Mhm.
We welcome that very much.
Yeah. Yeah, I noticed there's a range in length of the pieces. Some are quite short, like micro pieces, and some are longer.
Right.
Yeah. Do you find like what is your readership like? Do you find that you have a sense of who is reading the material published on the site? You have like relationships with readers?
We do. We do have relationships with readers, and what I guess there's not really a good way for me to gauge the demographics or say what the demographics are for sure. Um, and mostly that's because I'm pretty dumb about reading analytical,
Yeah.
the analytics. I'm just not. It's just not my forte. Um, but we do, I mean, we have been on social media, and that helps a lot, to let people know. And I know that every time that we publish a new issue, we get a lot of new readers. Whether
Hmm.
they stick with us, it's hard to say. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, there's a core of readers that usually remark in some way, either on social media or they write us
Hmm.
about what they've read and what they've enjoyed in the
Yeah.
last issue.
It
Yeah.
seems like because it's a magazine speaking to a specific place that it would be a good candidate for community building. Like, do you have a sense that you see repeat submissions from the
Oh,
same
yeah.
writers and
Yeah.
you sort of keep in touch and there's like a sense of a connection among people?
Yes, and in fact, we had kind of a wealth of repeat submitters, so much
Mhm.
so that we decided that we would ask people to wait a year after their
Oh, okay.
publication before they submitted again.
Right.
But yeah, we do have repeat submitters,
Uh-huh.
and we do publish people more than once. We
Yeah.
don't have problems with that at all,
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, um, we don't have like a formal newsletter that we send out or anything like that. We've been pretty lo-fi and low key
Mhm.
in terms of making a really fancy site. The other thing that we do is we not only publish writers, but we usually have an artist that we
Mhm.
spotlight every issue. We publish 3 times a year. Um, and that can be a visual artist. Sometimes it's a literary artist, but usually it's a
Mhm.
visual artist. We have what we call a multimedia feature, and that's usually either some kind of film or video that you can look at that has something to do either with literature or with the region in
Mhm.
some way.
Mhm.
Um, Very recently, we focused on a painter who grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, and then moved to New York, and then moved to Paris. Beaufort Delaney, whose family donated their home to make an artist studio in Knoxville.
Wow.
So that's an example.
Mhm.
Right now we have a feature up on Loretta Lynn since she just passed away.
Oh,
We have kind
yeah.
of a retrospective of her
Mhm.
work. So we
Mhm.
publish visual artists, musicians or filmmakers, writers, and then we have an interview just about every issue.
Mhm.
And although we don't have a new one this issue, we also have a craft feature
Mm.
called Still Life. So when we publish an issue, it's big. It's not just
Right.
poetry, nonfiction, and fiction. It's
Right.
also, other things. So
Chock full.
yeah, it's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you ever, this might not never come up as a problem, but if you're publishing writers who have a connection to the place, but the work itself doesn't necessarily deal with the place, do you ever worry that an issue will actually have work that has nothing to do with, like the content won't actually have any connection to the place?
No,
Okay.
we don't worry about that too much
Yeah.
because usually the writer has some sort of connection.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
um, and we're pretty clear about that in our submission guidelines that the work doesn't have to be about Appalachia, but we like to feature people who have some kind of connection to the region.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what are some common reasons for a piece to be rejected?
Um, I think that this is kind of universal and
Mhm.
not specific to still. Um, but it would be genres.
Mm.
Like we tend not to publish science fiction or inspirational
Mm.
literature, things like that, pornography.
Mhm.
So genre considerations. Um, Writing that's not quite ready yet to meet the reader,
Mhm.
I guess is a nice way to
Yeah.
say it. There's something that's not finished yet or not quite there yet.
Yeah.
Um, or it's blatantly nostalgic for nostalgia's
Mhm.
sake.
Mhm.
It's blatantly dark or something for, to I, I don't know. I can't think of a good example, but I think the same reasons that a lot of editors
Mhm.
uh, don't take work. We either have too many submissions and we just can't take it all,
Mhm.
um, it's not exactly what we're looking for at the time.
Mhm.
Occasionally we'll do themes. In poetry, we almost always have a little themed sampler.
Mhm.
This next issue that we're going to publish in February is going to be about
Mhm.
climate catastrophe, climate change. So
Mhm.
we're looking for submissions that have to do with that subject.
Mhm.
So I would say the same things, Becky, that other editors reject
Sure.
work for.
Sure.
Yeah.
One thing that's come up in my newsletter, we had a whole column dedicated to whether lit mags are ageist. And I think there was sort of a popular sentiment that people feel like a lot of lit mags focus on a younger demo, like the work that's published reflects a younger state of mind, a younger demographic. It seems like your journal would actually be a good magazine for older writers, like the sort of connection to a place and you know, I guess trying to avoid nostalgia, but but would you say that you
Yeah.
have that's true, that you see in the work that you publish like a broader array of writers represented?
Again, I'm not sure about the demographics, but
Mhm.
there may be something to that about age, although
Mhm.
we also work really hard to publish younger writers as
Mhm.
well. I mean, we
Mhm.
have a feature this time from high school
Oh.
students who were at a particular writing workshop at the Hindman Settlement School, which is in the mountains of eastern Kentucky,
Mhm.
and it's the first time that any of them have ever been published.
Aw.
And so we featured their writing workshop, and the director wrote a little introduction, and then they all submitted something that came from that week-long writing workshop for young people. So we do try to publish younger writers.
Yeah.
Um, Again, I'm fuzzy on the demographics,
Mhm. Mhm.
but I'm also really sensitive to that because as an older woman,
Mhm.
I know that our society tends to ignore people like me.
Mhm. Mhm.
We become sort of invisible and
Mhm.
unseen, and I'm really aware of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah,
your magazine is not affiliated with any kind of institution, university. It's just you guys.
yeah,
That's great.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so the one of the ways that we paid the bills in the
Mhm.
early days was that we always had a writing contest once a year,
Mhm.
and we would be able to make enough money in submission fees that we could pay our judges, pay
Mhm.
the prize for the winners, and then we'd have enough left over to pay for our website
Mhm.
and our domain and Submittable.
Mhm.
Um, so so yeah, it's hard when you don't
Yeah.
have institutional support,
Yeah.
and you're completely independent. Yeah.
Do you not run the contest anymore?
We haven't in several years,
Okay.
um, only because we were lucky enough that we just had we were able to just save,
Mhm.
from previous contests. What we're going to be doing, unfortunately, in the days to come, is that we're going to start charging a $3 submission fee.
Ah.
And I know that's really controversial, and I don't much like it either. And I resisted for
Mhm.
for about 5 years
Yeah.
doing it, but we're only going to charge $3. And of course, if that's a hardship for anybody, of course
Mhm.
we'll waive those fees. But that's a way again for us to pay the bills.
Yeah, is it, so we just read an article about this. I don't know if you saw it, but it was about Submittable, and it sounds like Submittable is like, it almost feels like they're holding holding editors hostage in some way, just
Yeah,
because it's so expensive. Is that
yeah,
what you're finding? Is that your situation?
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And we've thought about alternative ways that we could take submissions.
Mm.
And before Submittable, I mean, we just did it through email. But
Yeah.
oh my gosh, it's such a mess,
Yeah.
to do it. Submittable, organizes everything for you, puts it in
Mm.
little rows, and
Mm. Mm.
if sometimes we have readers who help us read submissions.
Mhm.
It's easy to assign those to them.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, it has its downfalls, but
Yeah.
it's also a great tool. But
Yeah.
you're
Sure.
right. I mean, I hadn't really thought about that, holding us hostage as editors.
It might be a little extreme, but but it seems like it's just that editors they're very reluctant to have to charge fees, but they feel like they have no other alternative if they're going to
Yeah,
use the software.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So back to the work, like when you're publishing, when you're accepting pieces, do you think about having the work communicate to other pieces that you're publishing in an issue? And might that be a reason for rejection? Like it's a great piece, but we already have something that talks about,
Yes.
changing color of the leaves and
Yes. Yes, that is very true. Although sometimes, I'll get, yeah, I mean, this just happens. There's no rhyme or reason to it, but like if we have an open call, one of the things that I do as poetry editor is I do look for themes that people are writing to. And
Mhm.
there's almost always some kind of thread that I can
Mhm.
pull to show showcase maybe 8 or 10 poets in a little sampler.
Mhm.
So I do that almost every issue. Like I think memory is the theme
Mhm.
for this issue. Last time I think it was elegies. We've done music. We've done all kinds of themes, but that kind of happens organically.
Mhm.
Um, and yes, we do share the work, the fiction and the nonfiction and the poetry. We share all that before we publish so that, sometimes there are real obvious
Mhm.
connections.
Mhm.
Sometimes they're not so obvious, but
Sure.
yeah, I mean, it's not like we try to have a theme every issue,
Mhm.
but we do like when that happens,
Mhm.
when
Sure.
there's some continuity between pieces. Yeah.
Do you have advice? Let's say there's a writer out there, they're watching this right now. They grew up in Tennessee. They're getting really excited. They feel like they might be able to send you a story. Do you have advice for them, like any particular thing that they should look for in their work to make sure it's doing XYZ or not doing XYZ? Should they, try to edit their beginning of the story in a certain way? Any specific advice for somebody who's watching this right now and getting ready to submit?
Not really in terms of specific advice in terms of like editing a story or a poem this way or that.
Mhm.
No, I I wouldn't advise that. I would advise that if they want to send us something, that they do ask themselves, what does this have to do with Appalachia? What can I say about Appalachia that's not already been said
Mhm.
a thousand times or in a certain way? And what is going to make my poem or my story unique
Mhm.
so that the editor will pay attention to it.
Mhm. But it doesn't have to it doesn't necessarily have to do with Appalachia, correct? Or so they should
Correct.
see if there's a link, but it doesn't necessarily have to be there. Is that
Correct.
yeah, okay. Um and so are you ever looking for people to get more involved as readers, as volunteers? Do you ever need help?
Yes, sometimes we do, and usually we've never done an open call, like be a reader for us, but
Mhm.
we do call on our friends sometimes to help us read through submissions,
Mhm.
particularly if it's a big load.
Yeah.
Um, Sometimes well, it just depends. We almost always have way more poems than we will ever be able to use in a
Yeah.
lifetime. Um, and usually fiction's pretty big. Creative nonfiction
Mhm.
is sometimes um, not as widely submitted to as the other two genres.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if somebody also watching this thinks like, oh wow, this looks like a cool magazine, I'd love to be a reader, volunteer in some capacity, should they drop you a line? Is that something?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
right, absolutely. And we also, invite people who have ideas for book reviews.
Mhm.
Oh, that's the other thing that we do, Becky, that I didn't even mention is we occasionally do reviews. I think we have 5 book reviews in this
Mhm.
particular issue. That's unusual, but that just is kind of how it worked out. But people who have ideas for book reviews, interviews, artwork, multimedia, still life or a craft feature, if they have ideas that they want to pitch to us, they can always write us an
Mhm.
email.
That's great. So this is a question that I ask all editors. What keeps you going? You've been doing this for since 2009.
Right.
It sounds like it's fun, it's meaningful, you're engaged with the community. I imagine it's also a lot of work, and you're also teaching full time at a university. So, you know, and you also like want to do things in the world, I'm sure. So how do you, you know, keep your excitement going for this project? What when that invariably starts to like flag at times, how do you kind of muster your energy for it?
That's a really good question. And one of the reasons that Silas House left the magazine was because he wanted to concentrate more fully and carefully on his own writing.
Mm.
And he's just published another novel.
Oh, nice.
So, I understand that. And
Mhm.
Jason, my other co-founder, Jason Howard, left because he began to edit another magazine. And so he couldn't do two,
Mhm.
he could be editor of two literary magazines. So, but that's a really good question because I've been through a lot of personal things. Like both of my parents were sick and dying,
Mm.
in the last 13 years that I've been doing this. Um, I have two other family members with chronic illnesses, and so sometimes it's really hard.
Mhm.
Um, but I I love to publish other people's writing, and
Mhm.
I love to be that catalyst to get
Yeah.
other people's work out in the world.
Yeah.
Um, so I'll we'll probably keep going, at least a couple of
Right.
more years. Oh, and by the way, my husband and I retired from full-time teaching
Oh.
in July. So that has freed up a lot of time for me,
Mhm.
and that's really been good.
Yeah.
That's a great thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. I think it's almost like a gene that editors have, like that feeling of you just there's real pleasure that you take in sort of shepherding other people's work into the world.
There really is. It
Yeah.
really is. And I mean, people have done that for me,
Mhm.
and I want to do it for others,
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That's great. Well, what's on the horizon for you? Do you have an issue coming out soon that people can look out for? And also you have a call for climate related writing going now.
right. So a couple of weeks ago, we just published our fall issue. We
Mhm.
publish in February, June, and October. So towards the end of October, we published our 40th issue, and we also have a call out for the climate issue.
Mhm.
And that call opens the 1st of December.
Mhm.
And it's only open like 15 days.
Okay.
Um, Mostly just because so we don't get inundated
Mhm.
inundated with a lot of a lot
Mhm.
of work. And we want to try also my co-editors are teachers, and so having Christmas break to read submissions is usually a good thing for us.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, so that'll be our February issue, will be the climate issue.
Mhm.
And then we'll probably open up submissions again in very early March
Okay.
for general everything.
Mhm.
Uh,
And the climate issue does not need to specifically be focused on Appalachia as long as it's Appalachian writers, or should it be place specific?
we'll consider both. We'll
Okay.
consider, yeah, but we are interested in climate as it's affecting Appalachia, particularly in the ways that Appalachia is particularly prone to flooding. And
Mm.
for example, this summer there were devastating floods
Mhm.
in Appalachia and eastern Kentucky,
Mhm.
where whole communities were just wiped off the map, and
Yeah.
some of those communities will probably not ever come back. Um,
Mm.
and a lot of that has to do with mining, coal mining, abandoned mines, mountaintop removal mining, which, lops off all the vegetation on a mountain.
Mm.
And then that, of course, because there's no topsoil, that affects flooding.
Mhm.
We're interested in that, uh,
Mhm.
those sorts of catastrophes
Yeah.
and how people are coping with that,
Mhm,
you know.
mhm. Yeah,
So
there's definitely a lot to say there. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. And everybody should go check out Still the Journal, and submit your work if you can, if you relate, and get out there and check it out. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you, Becky. I had a great time talking with you today.
Great. Thanks.